Okay, if you don't want to be recorded, please drop from the call. And your presence indicates that you agree to be recorded. Thank you very much, Tiffany. Let me see if I can move this thing too. Okay. All right. So the project governance framework, know the components, know the list, understand what each one of these is. So the project success and deliverable acceptance criteria. See this a lot in agile projects, where you have a formal acceptance list of acceptance criteria for each of the phases and for the project itself. A process to identify, escalate, and resolve issues. So you want to document all these things so that there are no questions about it if something occurs, like you need an issue resolved. Where do you go for that? Make sure it's written down. And then the relationship between the project team, organizational groups, and external stakeholders. So this is talking about how the project team works with any of the other groups here, organizational groups, that's any teams within the enterprise that would provide anything to you. I know in a lot of the telecommunication software projects, any of the new things usually depend on some of the legacy systems being involved. They may have just a little bit of effort. It may be test only, but we need to document how those groups uh, react or interact with the project team, and also external stakeholders. And if it's um, say the business, if it's a product owner, if it's a business owner, and also the external stakeholders can include any of your vendors. So really, that's what you need to establish, how each of these interacts with the project team. Project organizational chart with project roles. This just identifies who's doing what, and is a document that everybody who needs to know in that project would have access to. Communication processes and procedures. How do you communicate with people? Does one senior vice president want to see a stoplight chart? Another senior vice president want to have a written report every 2 weeks? Exactly how you're going to be communicating to which are your stakeholders. Okay. Any processes for decision making? Are you going to allow the development team to make decisions that are very close to them, so that if they have a problem that they're directly dealing with, can they resolve it? Do they have to escalate it to a higher authority? And just really where these decisions are made. I mean, do they come from the top, or can they be done at the grassroots level? Guidelines for aligning project governance and organizational strategy. Uh, it's really any documentation that's available on how to uh, make sure that your governance for your project is compatible with any other team that has project governance that you have to interface with, and make sure that what you're doing here fits into what the overall organizational strategy is. You don't want to be doing anything that's counter to what the organization has said that you needs to be done. And then the project lifecycle approach, you need to document how you're doing it. Is it going to be waterfall? Is it going to be agile? Is it going to be Scrum based? Is it going to be rapid design, rapid implementation, things like that? Your process for stage gate or phase reviews. Who needs to be invited? How do you do it? When do you do it? What are the deliverables? And a process for review and approval of changes above the project manager's authority. So you need to know who to go see about any uh, anything that needs to be reviewed and or changed that you don't have the authority to do. So rather than trying to find out when it occurs, it's always best to have that established in your framework at the very beginning, so you don't have to spend time uh, trying to find out where you need to go. And then a process to align internal stakeholders with project process requirements. Um, I think that goes without saying. Okay, so project phases. Project phase, and again, this is from the 6th edition. This is the definition. A collection of logically related project activities that culminates in the completion of one or more deliverables. A deliverable can be a document. A deliverable can be a working piece of software. A deliverable can be a completely paved section of road. It could be a completed building. It could be a completed floor of a building. Okay. So the project phase produces one or more deliverables. As I said, it could be the complete uh, paving, completion of a section of road, which would include all the grading, all the prep work, all of the uh, uh, using of ballast in there, uh, pouring concrete or asphalt, and doing all the striping and anything related to that, landscaping, so that all of those deliverables could be contained within a single phase. Or it could be just a design document, could, or requirements document could constitute a single phase deliverable. Okay. Now the phases, we're going to talk about this a little bit later too. You can perform the phases sequentially. So you complete phase one before you go to phase two, or in some cases you can overlap the phases where phase one will still be going on and you can start phase two, or you can use the indeterminate letters in there. Phase M can be can still be going while you start phase N. Okay, and especially when you have phase termination before you start a new phase, outputs from the first phase can generally be an input to the next phase. So uh, later phases can depend on the previous ones. And we're going to talk about applying governance to the project lifecycle. So when you before you start a phase, or when you first start, you verify and validate the formal assumptions made to the project. Okay, what assumptions did you make previously? Are they still valid? Analyze any risks that have come up in the previous phases. Look at the risk register that you had from when you started the project, see if anything is valid or invalid from there. And take a look at anything that's been unearthed at the beginning of this phase. And then also provide a detailed explanation of the phase's deliverables. Exactly what are you planning to deliver in this phase of the project? Then once you produce what that phase is going to produce, you should review those deliverables and you want to ensure that that phase of the project is complete and that the customer can accept it. Okay. Phase can be closed or the project terminated when huge risks are involved for the project or when the objectives are no longer required. So always be aware that uh, at the completion of a phase, it may be the time to terminate the project. Okay. I'm going to go backwards for 1 second. Yep. Okay. Okay. Talk about escalation paths. Um, Now, know the definition of a phase gate. And again, I don't know if this is on your slides or not, but they do note that this is from the 6th edition again. So all of the definitions that you'll see in this presentation are from the 6th edition. So a phase gate, a review at the end of a phase in which a decision is made to continue to the next phase, to continue with modification to what the original project goals were or phase goals were, or to end the project or the program at that time. And we'll talk about some of those criteria in another slide here. But you'll hear other things than phase gate. You can hear governance gate, toll gate, and kill point, uh, all the same thing. And what you use the gate for is to check to make sure that all of the exit criteria from the previous phase have been satisfied and that all the entrance criteria for the next phase are satisfied. Okay. Uh, and they say the software development projects use a specialized type of phase gate called a quality gate. That has been used in waterfall type projects. You're not going to see that in agile projects though. And in the illustration here, just realize that each of these orange circles are your phase gates. And this just shows that between phase 1 and phase 2, you have uh, a time, you take a time to evaluate whether your previous phase is completed and if you're ready to start the next phase. Same thing all the way down here. And phase-to-phase relationships. This is what we talked about a little bit earlier. We have sequential and overlapping relationships. So a sequential relationship contains consecutive phases that start only when the previous phase is complete. This relationship reduces the level of uncertainty, which may eliminate the option for shortening a project schedule. So if you're on schedule, this is the way to really do it if you want highest quality out of the project. Uh, Now, when you use Microsoft Project or do Gantt charts, this is analogous to that, where you have either end to start relationship or you have an end to start minus some period of time relationship between the phases. And then overlapping relationships contain phases that start prior to the previous phase ending. This relationship increases the level of risk and may cause rework if something from the previous phase directly affects the next phase. So this is the higher risk of the two because you don't know if all of the exit criteria and all of the entrance criteria have been satisfied by the previous phase. So you're going into this with some level of uncertainty. You need to plan for that. And it is a way to mitigate schedule slip. But again, it's a higher risk way of doing it. Okay, guidelines to determine appropriate governance for a project. If you don't have anything that is readily available and you have to construct this from scratch, involve the organization's decision managers, who are frequently its senior managers. It could be, within AT&T, you're talking about probably director and below or something like this, analogous to that. In some smaller companies, it may include the owner of the company, you know, person who's negotiated the contract with the customer too. Okay. What you want to do is establish some simple governance goals and make sure that they're appropriate to the project. You know, you you want to have something like you know, achieve all of the exit criteria for a particular phase. Okay? And then select a group of experienced individuals, people who have been through this before, to be responsible for all governance activities, doing the checks and balances here. Somebody who's been through this before, actually, it's good to have a small team of people who would be working this way. Now, this would be usually it's in addition to what their real jobs are. And what they're talking about here is 3 levels of governance. For projects, which roll up into programs, you need to have governance for the programs and then also for the entire portfolio of programs. So at each level here, portfolio, program, and project, you would have established what the governance is. And this is for waterfall projects, it's for agile efforts, it's for safe efforts. Okay. What it means here is keep the governance process transparent to the project stakeholders. It means that you don't just establish the governance and sock it away somewhere. The governance needs to be available to anybody who is a stakeholder in the project, and it really needs to be well known by everybody on the development team, everybody on the uh, business side. So anybody internally has to know what the governance is for that particular project or that particular phase. Okay, and governance is an evolutionary process. You start with the best that you know at the time you establish it. You take the lessons that you've learned along the way, and then you modify the governance based on the best that you know at that particular point in time. Always take the best that you know. Don't worry about modifying the governance. You want to be sure that it's the best job that you can do at that particular point in time. Okay. We don't have an activity. So we're going to talk about the other topic for today, which is plan and manage project or phase closure. Were there any questions on governance before I get into this? Okay. The enablers for this are determine criteria to successfully close the project or phase, develop transition planning artifacts, validate readiness for transition. For example, the operations team would get the results of a software project, or you go to the next, be able to go to the next phase. Conclude activities to close out the project or phase. Okay. Now, deliverables that they list are definition of done. This is for both waterfall and agile efforts. And then validate the work that you've done. And they don't list any specific tools. So it's going to depend on the situation that you're in. Uh, this may be a question on the test where what are the tools that are used uh, to close the project or the phase. Okay. The activities that they list that are important during closeout. Planned work is completed. Project or phase information is archived. And the project team resources are released to pursue other endeavors. Now, this is PMBOK Guide version 6. You'll see something different within AT&T in the next year to 2 years, where uh, we are going to more persistent teams so that we don't release team resources. We bring more work to the team that's been established. One of the uh, downfalls of releasing teams resources to work on other things is if you don't keep the teams intact, you lose the synergy that they have established working together. Now, some teams may be dysfunctional, and that's okay. Then you need to reestablish a team with people who can work synergistically. But for the most part, the way we've been doing things for the last 20 years or so is to release the people once and any of the lab equipment, things like that, whenever the project or a phase where they're no longer needed is completed. So know this though, this will be, if they have a question on the test, answer it based on what we have here in the slides. Okay. Close project or phase, or the phase criteria for that. Know the list that any one of the following events can result in closure. The happy path is that the project or phase successfully meets all its completion objectives. And this can be something that has been uh, as a result of a change request or a reprioritization. If the requirements change during the phase and they change significantly to where the project is no longer feasible, then it may be necessary to just close out the project. We never see this at AT&T where adequate funding is no longer available to complete the project requirements. That know this one too. It will may be on the test. Significant risks are encountered that make the successful completion of the project impossible, and these should be identified, with by the PM. Excuse me, by the PM in conjunction with leadership and with the development teams. Okay. So there can be risks that are identified by the development teams. If a particular solution is no longer viable because of support questions or end of life things such as that, or it could be that the market has changed at that particular point in time, and it is risky as to whether or not a profit could be made by deploying uh, that project, whether it's software, whether it's a railroad, whether it's a building, whatever. Okay. Or the organization no longer needs the project deliverables. So if you're this is more of a market change, and it can be internal or external depending on who your customer is. Examples of those external factors that can arise and do away with the need for the project: change in laws or regulations, a merger or acquisition that affects the organization, and that can be the organization that's developing the project or the organization that is buying the result of the project. Okay. Global or national economic changes. It can be anything from a country going bankrupt. It can be something like what we're seeing today with the supply chain being so bottled up that companies can no longer afford some external projects. They need to get their manufactured goods and services in, or goods in, so that they can sell them to have enough cash to do another project. So think globally with this. Whatever, and there are more. This is none of these are complete lists, as they, uh, you know, when they say examples of these factors include, this is definitely not an inclusive list. Okay. Okay, so closing procurements. This is when you've got a contract with an external vendor to supply you something. Where they're supplying, you're paying for it. Okay, so procurements are closed when the contract terms of a procurement have been satisfied by both the buyer and the seller. So you don't want to wait until the project or the phase is closed out to close the procurement window. You don't want any extraneous charges against the procurement contract, and you don't want any unintentional charges against the contract. And as they say here, it occurs through the life of the project and not just for project. And you can extrapolate this to phase also, closure. So whenever a contract is satisfied by both sides, you pay it, you terminate the contract then. You close the procurements. Now, acceptance. We're talking about acceptance criteria here. A set of conditions that is required to be met before deliverables are accepted. Now, acceptance criteria, at least in an agile sense, are developed by.
Why not you try it? But still fit. Yeah, let me know. Yeah.
Was there a question there?
No, the top.
Okay, if you're not asking a question, please mute. Thank you. Okay. So project deliverables are deemed accepted when certain acceptance criteria have been met. And the acceptance criteria, is, I started out before, uh, in Agile instances, the acceptance criteria are determined by the uh, product owner for like user stories, by the product manager for features, and by higher authorities for any of the epics or any of anything higher than that. Okay. And the acceptance criteria need to be established prior to starting the phase or prior to starting the project so that the development teams and everybody on the project has a clear idea of what they're supposed to be delivering. And and they have an idea of what is acceptable to the uh, to the customer of the product. Okay. Uh, these criteria generally refer to some or all of the requirements that were established at the beginning of the project. And notice that acceptance criteria can be modified during the project's life cycle. Now, as you learn more, if there are any changes that are made uh, by the product owner or by the result of something that the development team has discovered. So it can be both ends. You usually have a formal sign off for the acceptance criteria, and you get the approval of the customer or the sponsor. Now, in Agile efforts, you're going to see a demonstrations of the functionality that are delivered within that phase or within that project being uh, a taking the place of some of the written uh, evidence. So what you're doing is demonstrating to the customer that what you're delivering actually works. Okay, payments. Make sure payments are made to a supplier or vendor in accordance with the terms of the contract between the buyer and the supplier or vendor. It could be a net so many number of days. Um, it could be payment is due immediately upon acceptance of whatever the vendor is supplying. There depends on what the industry criteria are, and it depends on what you have established with that particular vendor in the contract that you sign, uh, where they're delivering something, you're paying for it. And again, unless the contract is closed at the completion of the project or phase, payment will most likely have been made at the time of the contract closure. Okay. Don't delay closing a contract or making a payment until the project or phase closure, unless it's specified in the contract. So you don't want any extraneous charges uh, to the account that's paying for that contract. Knowledge management, lessons learned repository. And again, this is based on PMBOK Guide 6th edition. A store of historical information about lessons learned in projects. You want to have a lessons learned register, and you want to finalize that during either the project or phase closure. And you compile this lessons learned register throughout the project lifecycle. This is for both waterfall and for agile projects. The document, the phase, uh, the lessons learned repository should then be added to the lessons learned. Okay. What you've learned needs to be added to the lessons learned repository, which is a database of lessons learned from multiple projects. I guess there are some organizations that keep these, and this is what you need to know for the exam. I know AT&T has had lessons learned repositories. I've not known of too many efforts that have taken advantage of previous lessons learned, though. Just, yeah. Then transition planning artifacts. What are you going to produce? Really document the coordination and strategy about how to best deliver and transition the product and any of the other deliverables. Okay. Uh, Releasing and deploying deliverables is the most suitable manner, in the most suitable manner, ensures end user awareness and increases the proper usage and adoption of outputs. So you want to be sure to give it to your customer in a form that they can use. So we used to deliver things on 9-track magnetic tapes. We used to deliver them on discs. Um, you know, do should they do they want to be able to pull them from a website? Do they need documentation delivered with it, or should they be able to access that website for any of the documentation that they need? Questions about that. And then some of the artifacts include training. Does that need to be delivered in person by the vendor, uh, by the team that delivers the project? Does it need to be virtual training? And can it be computer based? Things like that. Any of the documentation, as I mentioned. Communication, how you're going to interact with people with that, and then any of the support that is required. I mean, we're going to have a 24/7 hotline for them to uh, get in touch with. Are you going to have like a chat-based method for the customer to communicate with you? Exactly how are you going to do that for support and communications? Okay, transition readiness. So what we're talking about here is determining how we're ready to move on to the next phase or to complete the project. So releasing, delivering, and deploying the project's work into an environment that is not ready may negate its value. So what you really need to do is synchronize things. Make sure that the target environment is ready, that if you're deploying to a customer, that everything that their system is meets all of the entry criteria for accepting your software or your product. Okay? And project teams must examine the readiness of all parties and prepare them for delivery. And the people that you need to prepare are the end users, the business. Make sure that you have the physical resources necessary to deploy that particular phase or that particular project. And then also make sure that the project team is aware of when it needs to be deployed and that all of the proper preparation has been done by the project team to allow that particular product to be deployed. So most critical in situations where there's an upgrade or improvement to an existing product or service. This is mostly targeting software. And I mean, AT&T does have a good example for when what this is talking about with the what we have are triannual releases, where there's an entire team that works on making sure that all the logistics are in place to allow a deployment to customer sites. Now, you need to assess the readiness of all parties, implement the transition plans accordingly, and capture any of the lessons learned for the next release or the next phase of the project. Okay, lessons learned register. Okay. And this again is from PMBOK Guide, 6th edition. Project document used to record knowledge gained during a project so that it can be used in the current project and entered into the lessons learned repository. Now, things that you can put in there are anything you learned about scheduling. You know, if you learned that one of your offshore teams had holidays during a critical phase of the project, you can note that, and it will definitely vary depending on which teams you have engaged. And if I know AT&T uses teams in India, in Israel, and so you need to be aware of those local holidays or those national holidays in those countries. Anything you learned about conflict resolution or conflict management? How did you handle you know, any conflict between two or more of the parties? You know, what worked? Did it? If you were working with an external vendor and they couldn't deliver on time, how did you resolve it? Okay. Seller's lessons learned. Uh, what did you learn about your end customer? Were they were there indicators that they would not be able to pay for the project? Things like that. Any of the customer lessons learned? Uh, you know, as a customer of a vendor in that particular phase of the project or the project overall, or what you learned from your customers. Strategic lessons learned. I mean, did the project take too long to deliver something that was required much sooner by the customer? You know, did you develop the project and then learn that there was no use for it? Things like that. Any of the tactical lessons learned? Um, you know, did you have a problem overlapping phases? Uh, did you have a problem with sequential phasing? Exactly what you know, if you introduced a new um, development system, did the development team have enough time to become familiar with it so that you didn't experience project delays? Okay. And then go back to your lessons learned throughout the project and, take the most important ones. And then close out meetings. You have this at the end of a session, at the end of a project or phase, and you review the work and you review the lessons learned. Um, we'll talk about an Agile specific one next, that you can include stakeholders, team members, any of the people who worked on the project itself, and your customers. And what you wanted to really understand is any of the difficulties that the customers had, any of the difficulties that the project team had in developing the project, things like that, so that the next time around you can uh, either craft your requirements or your features and user stories in a way that it avoids some of the problems that you've seen within this project. Okay, so just using this to become better the next time. Now, for Agile, we engage in retrospectives at the end of each. We can call it phase or program increment or sprint, and also at the end of when when the final product's delivered. Now, include the whole Agile team, the product owner, and any of the key stakeholders. And this can go to the project or the product manager. It can involve leadership. It can involve the owner of a company if it's small enough, things like that. Uh, in the retrospective, you talk about things that went well and you talk about things that didn't go so well. And really uh, do a root cause analysis. If take the time to do that if there's a significant issue that came up, and determine how you could have done it better. Gather ideas. Make sure that you honor all the ideas that are put out. Uh, I think I talked about this in the previous session about petting a cat when they were looking at a way to get oil out of extremely deep wells when it was boiling off when the atmospheric pressure was reduced. So, calming the oil down, the way petting a cat can calm it down. So, honor any of the ideas that come out of a retrospective. Discuss them at the very least. Uh, in addition to the work on the product, you want to take a look at the processes that were used to produce that deliverable and assess the level of collaboration both inside the project itself and then outside the Agile team. And then any of the other areas that influence the effectiveness of product delivery. And if you had laboratory requirements, things like that, needed better assessment on when the labs would be available, things like that. Okay. And then guidelines to close the project or phase. Review the project management plan. The project management plan lives with you throughout the entire life of the project and needs to be updated continuously. Okay, you need to review that. Make sure that uh, you identify where the project went well, where the project had some problems, some issues. Uh, it'd be nice if you had a project termination checklist. What do you need to do to terminate this project? And do you need complete customer acceptance? Can you have conditional acceptance with a punch list? Uh, uh, Punch list being a list of items that have to be closed before the customer will fully sign off and pay you. Okay? Exactly what you need to do. Do you need to file documents within a particular repository? Do you need an acknowledgement that you did do that? Things like that. Do you have to have a final review with senior management? So making a checklist always helps. And then gather and organize performance measurement documentation. product documentation, and other relevant project records. So you're going to gather all that for the repository. Make sure that your project's products meet compliance requirements if they're just established by the customer or by the governance that you've established, or whether there are specific laws or ordinances that have to be complied with. Is release project resources. Again, I'll mention that this is historically what we've done, that for each new project, we establish a new project team, and we're making a transition to, but it won't be on the test, where we have persistent teams, where teams, once they finish a particular effort, uh, will will stay intact and just bring more work to them. Update records to ensure that they reflect the final specifications. We, uh, when I was with the FAA installing equipment in the field, we did what we called red lines on any of, and we actually had blueprints that were sent out to the field that we had to follow to get the projects done. And this was installing like a radar site or a communication site, upgrading equipment, things like that. So it would include things like cable routing, um, placement of equipment in racks, things like that. And if you had to deviate from that particular specification on the blueprint, you'd go back through, and at the end of the project, you'd take a red pen and draw in exactly what you did that was different. You sent that back into the regional office, and they'd have a draftsman go through and update the blueprints, and then all the blueprints were filed for each of the projects. So, it can be something like that, which is probably never done anymore, at any of the records that need to be updated. Uh, Sure to update the resource pool database, and this, we're talking people here, to reflect new skills and increase levels of proficiency. And it's know this definition here. I know at AT&T we have people update on their own, what their proficiency is and any of the new skills that they've acquired. But in some organizations, they will have the project manager make sure that this occurs, whether the PM does it himself or herself, or whether they make sure that the individuals involved upgrade their skills and proficiency levels. Okay. Analyze project success and effectiveness and document your lessons learned. We've talked about that. Prepare lessons learned reports and a final project report. This would be the requirements for this would be established by the governance, uh, by leadership, and whether or not you need to do that. Obtain project approval and formal project acceptance. This would be from your customer or the delegate, your from your customer, and also from internally too. Can be from leadership and from your financial representatives. Um, Archive a complete set of index project records so that they can be used to learn from in case there's another project similar to yours. And then, this is really one of the most important things, is to celebrate the success of the project with the team and other stakeholders. Um, I talked in a previous session about time when I was with another company when we had to produce a processor board that was an upgrade uh, for all of the products that we sold. Um, and we were able to deliver it. The customers bought a huge number of them, and it was quite a successful project. And at the end of that, we had celebrations at each of the facilities where people contributed to that success. There was a team in Arizona, there was a team in Illinois, there was a team in Texas. We had separate celebrations at each of those places, and it it was appreciated. Um, so, you know, always keep that in mind. People like to understand, not just be told, but understand that their contributions were valuable. Okay. And so our learning goals were assess project needs, complexity, and magnitude to determine the appropriate project methodology and methods and practices. Plan and manage scope, plan and manage the budget and resources, plan, prepare, modify, and manage the project schedule based on your methodology, plan and manage the quality of products and deliverables, integrate project planning activities, plan and manage procurement strategy, establish the project governance structure, plan and manage project and phase closure. So these are the learning goals for this entire phase. Okay. Any questions? As we're at the end of the slides.
I have the same
I did have
question
a
that's in the
question.
chat.
I had a question. I
Okay.
had a question on how long you track a project, the results, before you close out a project officially. Like, do you track it for 30 days, 90 days, 120
It depends
days?
on what your governance is. You establish that before the project starts.
Okay,
Okay.
gotcha. All right,
You know,
thank you.
I know with some projects at AT&T, some of the software projects at AT&T, we have a warranty period or had a warranty period where a certain number of people were still on the project and could charge to the expense portion of the project up until I think it was a 90-day warranty period. So 3 months after the software was delivered. So it may vary from that, but you need to establish that as part of the governance. There was another question out there. No? Okay. Now there are some questions for reflection. Now, why do you think developing project and scope management plans is important? And why do you think it's important to collect requirements, define scope, and create a work breakdown structure? Anybody want to reflect on that?
Should be and chaos, right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat, please? You were cutting out.
Sure. I was saying that I think the response for both of the questions should be to prevent chaos from reigning in the project and a lot of misunderstandings happening.
Yep, that's a good answer. Definitely. Chaos and
I
anarchy.
think I think it's also to show and provide the value to the customer.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I
That's
would
another
say it
factor.
tells you what's going to be done and how it's done. And without that, you don't have a project.
Right. You have to establish manage expectations of everyone. If it's going to be a lean Christmas, you better get that established up front, right?
Right.
Hey, Harry, there's
Yeah.
a question in the chat.
Okay.
It's not
Right now,
me,
can you
but
read it to me?
sure. Somebody said, how long do you track the project results before you close out a project officially? I have
Okay.
kind of had an answer, but I thought that might be something you may want to answer to
That
the
Yeah,
was
group.
me.
that was
I
the
just
first
asked
question
that.
that we had.
That was the
Oh,
I
if
put
I
that
missed
in the
it, I'm
chat.
so sorry.
It's
No, that's
okay.
okay. I'll repeat it. It's established by governance. You establish that up
Oh,
front.
government. Okay.
Yeah.
I apologize.
No,
Sorry.
that's okay. That's okay. I appreciate you checking the chat. I unfortunately the way I've got PowerPoint set up, I can't see that stuff. And I'm flying single tonight, so
Well, we appreciate it. Thank you.
it's my pleasure. I mean, the PMP exam is well, it's difficult. It's not by no means is it impossible. And these sessions give people a good idea, I think, of what they're going to see on the exams and an opportunity to answer questions too. So really, uh, it's a lot better than trying to take the exam cold. I'll tell you that.
So my name's Heather. I'm a program manager, and I handle a pretty big contract. And so there's a lot of hands in pretty much everything we do, but there contractually, there's always projects happening, and when I'm reflecting on what you're asking, I know that one of the very most important things is that there's such a huge space for error if you don't define and create the structure to everything, for everything. And it's always the little things that the customers pay attention to if you miss it.
Oh yeah.
So chaos was a good answer.
Yeah. And in a previous session, we talked about, the ways that you could mitigate differences, especially when closing out a contract. And the last thing you ever want to do is to go to court. And a lot of the right preparation up front, as Heather was saying, will really help to mitigate anything further on down the line. And you don't want to hold up a project just because the customer is nitpicking something.
And sometimes that's dollar amounts. So
Oh,
I
yes.
handle the state of Texas. We have $1 billion contract with the state of Texas, and I'm the program manager for it. It has, we have management plans that have to be updated every year, or if the customer wants it, every day. And we have dollar amounts that are tied to so many different pieces of different projects, wireline, mobility, SLAs. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm running around with a hat that literally is on fire.
Yeah. Like that little emoji in Q, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they do, the state of Texas was a little bit different than some of the other contracts that I'd worked with, because we'd make the news if something went wrong. Going to court definitely could happen. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can see why you want to be very diligent to complete everything up front.
Right.
So Harry, this is Susan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Susan.
Yeah, I have another example. I worked in the federal government, and I was funded for 5 years from Congress to do an upgrade of a federal building network. And I managed to pull it into a 3-year program instead of a 5-year program because it was so needed. I was able to convince them through really good project planning that I could pull it off in 3 years if they would just fund me earlier for the equipment that was needed. But otherwise, we could manage the actual resources, the people resources that were required to do it, and we could handle it in 3 years if we could just get the money for the equipment and materials. But the reason defining the scope was so important for me in that project is because it went over multiple years and you ended up getting new bodies involved with the project in the management levels. And they would attempt to either take the money that I was given by Congress, which was technically illegal, or they would, which I always went back to say that's I guess I could do that, except I won't be able to complete the project. So I'll just make sure we notify the stakeholder committee of that and Congress with our next report, because we had to report to Congress what we're doing with the money regularly. And they would be like, oh, don't threaten me. But in the end, it was all I could do, right? To hold on to the money was, tell them that we wouldn't be able to complete the scope of the project. I didn't have a lot of fat in there. We planned really, really well. And then the other thing was they would try to add on things. So there was no money in the budget. It was never established. It was within the scope for us to remove the copper associated with the original wiring. So there was copper all over this building, and we were not funded to remove any of that. And so they kept trying to add that onto the scope of the project, that while we were, in closets and running things down conveyance, we could just pull out the old stuff. And it was obviously a much bigger project than that. Because nobody was really sure, it's all spaghetti in there, and nobody's really sure what it's all wound up in and what's connected to what. And it would have taken a really long time to do that. So it was things like that, and having a really well-defined program and scoped out and documented, and all of that really, really helped a lot. And the governance as well, because there were multiple organizations involved, and trying to figure out how you escalated things and how you got things resolved across organizational structures with whoever, when all of those organizations thought they were more important, or the people who should be making the decision. Getting it all defined up front really helped defend the program for a good the whole 3 years. It was really well done. It was a good, following project management really saved me the entire time.
That's great to hear. That's really great to hear. And the thing is, with government projects, you've got so many more requirements than you do if you're just selling something into the general public. And
Absolutely true statement.
Yeah. When I was with the FAA, we had rules where if you had a customer or a vendor want to take you out to lunch or dinner, you had to pay for it on your own. That still exists
Absolutely.
today. Things like that. And when you were mentioning that about taking the old wiring out, one of the big projects I was on when I was with the FAA was modernizing the radar room at Detroit Metro Airport, and the instructions on the project instructions requirements was to remove the old cabling. And we investigated it and found that it was the stuff that we would have to remove was the original cabling that was laid down in the cable troughs. And there were about 20 layers of cables on top of it. So,
Absolutely.
Oh my gosh.
yeah,
Absolutely.
needless to say, we that stuff's still there. I don't see how anybody could have removed it.
I have a question about that point and how it relates to the questions that we have on the screen.
Sure.
Had it not been part of the requirements from the beginning, and let's say it was possible, how do we match something like, okay, maybe for me it's better to add this item to the scope to make the rest of the project to run, I don't know, easy, run more efficiently, or basically just to do a proper job if it was actually feasible to remove those cabling. How do we match that? Okay, this one item will help me with the overall project and avoid scope creep, which relates probably to the first questions. Like, okay, what if we don't define it from the beginning, but once that I'm here, if I remove this cable today, it will help me a lot moving forward, and it will help maybe other projects that I will start implementing in this same area.
Well, that's where your change management comes in. You need that needs to be discussed at the appropriate levels and determine whether or not it can be accommodated within the existing contract or scope of the project, or change the scope of the project, or if there needs to be a negotiation with the customer for an upcharge for doing that. So it's going to depend on what your leadership wants to do. And you should have a
In my
change
case,
control process in place.
Right. In my case with the government, that would have been a request all the way to Congress. And the way Congress would handle it was, because they gave you the money to do a certain thing, they would say, well, they must have overfunded you then, and they'll cut some of your money, because it's not my decision to decide what else to do with Congress's money. It's their decision. So you would end up getting your budget cut. And I know it sounds like all wrong, but because you're trying to do a good thing and the right thing, but that's just how it happens if you're working with congressional dollars.
So bottom line is, check before you do it. No.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, if not, I'd like to thank everybody who's contributed. I think we had a good discussion here, and we're able to give you back a couple of minutes. So you can use them for studying time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so
For,
much, Mary.
Thank you.
for attending tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thank you, Harry.
Welcome.
Thank you. Have a good night.